6 years, 9 years, 12 years. That number gets printed on the box in type you can read from halfway down the aisle. It usually explains why one tank costs a couple $100 more than the nearly identical one standing beside it, and most buyers read it the way they'd read a date stamped on a gallon of milk. Pay for 12, get 12. The paperwork tells a different story. Unfold the certificate that ships taped to the jacket, the one that goes straight into a kitchen drawer and stays there, and the term stops being a promise about time. Rheem's certificate for its 12-year residential gas and electric heaters describes the coverage as 3 years of full warranty followed by 9 years of limited warranty, then lists what it will not cover. Damages caused by operating the water heater with the anode rod removed. Failures caused by operating it with an empty or partially empty tank, which the certificate itself calls dry firing. Units removed from the original installation location. Units that have had their rating labels removed. A.O. Smith's residential warranty is blunter and spots. Void if the heater fails due to sediment buildup, if it has no temperature and pressure relief valve certified to the required standard, or if it's installed in a closed system without adequate provision for thermal expansion. Bradford White's current residential warranty excludes anode rod consumption outright, along with any installation made in violation of applicable codes. None of that is buried in 6-point legalese. It sits on one folded page that's shipped with the appliance. The reason to care is the number on the other end. Home Advisor's cost data for 2025 puts the national average for a water heater replacement at roughly $1,346, with a typical range of about $881 to $1,826, and tank-style installations spanning something like $600 to $2,500, depending on fuel, size, and whatever the plumber has to correct while he's standing there. That's a reported range from one cost-tracking source, not a quote, and your town may sit outside it. It still frames the stakes honestly. A denied claim in year 8 is a 4-figure Saturday. So the useful question is what those documents are actually measuring, because once you see it, the exclusion list stops reading like an escape hatch and starts reading like a maintenance specification nobody explained at the counter. Here's the whole key, and it's short enough to carry around. A tank water heater is a steel drum with a thin layer of glass fused to the inside. That lining is very good and it is not perfect. It has pinholes, it stops at the threaded fittings, and it sits in constant contact with hot water carrying dissolved minerals and oxygen, which is exactly the environment steel hates. So manufacturers hang a rod of a more reactive metal inside the tank, wired electrically to the steel. Magnesium usually, or an aluminum zinc alloy. That rod corrodes, so the tank doesn't. Every gallon of hot water you draw spends a little of it, and when it's gone, the tank starts spending itself. Call that the corrosion clock. The second thing is pressure. Water expands when you heat it. Not much, but it can't be compressed, and modern plumbing increasingly gives it nowhere to go backward either. Put a check valve, a pressure-reducing valve, or a backflow preventer on the incoming line, and you've built what the trade calls a closed system. Now every heating cycle raises pressure inside a sealed box. Call that the pressure path. Corrosion clock. Pressure path. Nearly every condition printed in those documents exists to control one or the other, and once you read with that in hand, you can predict most of the list before you reach it. Start with the one that costs almost nothing and gets skipped anyway. Nobody at the store mentions the anode rod. It isn't a feature, it never comes up in the sales pitch, and for years it makes no noise and produces no symptom. Meanwhile, it's the component the entire tank warranty leans on. EEO. Smith's Use and Care Guide for its residential electric heaters puts the schedule in plain language. Drain and flush the tank and remove and inspect the anode rod after the first 6 months of operation, and at least annually after that. GE Appliances tells owners to inspect the rod annually and replace it when more than 6 inches of bare core wire shows at either end. And buried in the troubleshooting pages of that AO, Smith Guide is a line that ought to be printed on the jacket in red. To protect the tank, an anode rod must be installed in the water heater at all times, or the warranty is void. So the mistake isn't neglect in some vague moral sense. The owner is running the tank's corrosion clock at whatever rate the water dictates, with no idea how much is left while the coverage assumes somebody is watching. The correction is unglamorous. Sometime in the first year, have the rod pulled and looked at and write down what you saw. That single observation sets your interval. Thick and mostly intact after a year means you can look again in 2 or 3. Chewed down to bare wire means your water is aggressive and you're on an annual schedule. The boundary matters. That rod is threaded into the top of the tank and is often seized hard enough that a breaker bar and a brace tank are the only things that move it, and on some models it's under the top pan or built into the hot water outlet. If it doesn't want to come, stop and call a plumber. Nobody wins a wrestling match with a seized rod. And nobody touches it until the power or gas is off and the tank is depressurized, which we'll come back to properly. The second one is pure paperwork and the cheapest loss on this list. Coverage doesn't start when the tank was built. It starts when it was installed, and the manufacturer has to be able to see that. Bradford White's residential warranty runs from the date of installation or without proof of installation from 3 months after the date of manufacture. Rheem's certificate gives a shorter grace. Absent documented proof of purchase, the clock runs from the date of manufacture plus 30 days. Sounds trivial. Tanks sit in warehouses and on showroom floors for months, and every one of those months comes off your end. A second deadline hides in the same documents. Rheem's residential warranty policy reserves the right to deny any claim submitted more than 90 days after the in-warranty defect occurred. A tank that started weeping in February and got mentioned to somebody in July has a paperwork problem on top of a plumbing problem. The fix takes 4 minutes. Photograph the rating plate, photograph the finished installation, keep the invoice with the installer's name and license number on it. Register the unit if the brand offers it. Store all of it somewhere that survives a phone upgrade. Then report any failure the same week you notice it while the window is still open. Third, and this is where good intentions start showing up, every one of these warranties conditions coverage on how the thing was installed. Rheem excludes damages resulting from failure to install in accordance with applicable building codes and ordinances or good plumbing and electrical trade practices. A.O. Smith voids coverage where the heater wasn't installed per local plumbing and building codes. Bradford White excludes defective installation, including any made in violation of applicable federal, state, or local codes. The claim process quietly enforces it too. Rheem requires an invoice from a professional plumbing contractor to substantiate a warranty labor claim, and A.O. Smith says labor and service aren't covered if the service provider determines the unit was installed incorrectly or not properly maintained. A competent homeowner can absolutely swap an electric tank in a basement. People do it every weekend. But whoever reviews that job later shows up with a list in hand rather than an eye for craftsmanship. Relief valve, discharge piping, venting and combustion air on a gas unit, dielectric connections. Permit where the jurisdiction requires one. Miss one and the defect you're claiming becomes on paper a consequence of the installation. The purchase channel belongs here too. Bradford White states plainly that its heaters should be purchased through and installed by qualified professionals only, and that you won't find its products in the big box stores. Buy a brand like that off a third-party marketplace and you may own a perfectly good water heater with no supported path back to the manufacturer. Fourth is the missing part, and this is the pressure path in the flesh. Heat a tank of water and it swells. Around 2% by volume, going from cold tap temperature up to a normal setting, which in a 50-gallon tank is roughly a gallon of extra water looking for somewhere to be. On an old open system, it pushed gently back into the street main and nobody knew. Add a pressure-reducing valve or a backflow preventer at the meter, which utilities increasingly require, and that gallon has nowhere to retreat. Pressure in the house climbs every time the burner or the elements fire. That's why the International Plumbing Code requires that where a storage water heater is supplied with cold water passing through a check valve, pressure-reducing valve, or backflow preventer, a thermal expansion control device be connected to the cold supply downstream of all of them. In practice, a small bladder tank hanging off the cold line for a fraction of what the heater costs. Without it, the tank absorbs those spikes cycle after cycle, the relief valve starts weeping to protect everybody, and the weeping gets diagnosed as a bad valve and replaced, sometimes twice, while the actual cause keeps running. A.O. Smith voids the warranty outright where the heater is installed in a closed system without adequate provision for thermal expansion. Bradford White excludes it in the same breath as installing without a proper relief valve. Rheem excludes damages caused by subjecting the tank to pressures greater than those shown on the rating label. The diagnostic is cheap. A hose thread pressure gauge on a washing machine connection or another faucet known to be on the house side of the pressure-reducing valve or backflow device costs about as much as lunch. Some exterior faucets are connected before those controls, so a reading there can miss what the heater is doing to the indoor system. Read it cold, then again after the heater has run a full cycle with no water drawn. A clear rise points toward trapped thermal expansion and deserves a look at the expansion tank and the rest of the pressure controls. Those tanks aren't permanent. They hold a charge of air behind a rubber bladder, and once that charge is gone, the tank is a decorative lump of steel. Checking and setting it to match house pressure is a routine service call. Fifth is the one where the honest answer is that nobody did anything wrong. Softened water is easier on skin, on fixtures, on the elements. It's harder on the anode rod. A.O. Smith's guide says it directly. If you use a water softener, your anode rod will deplete faster than normal, so inspect it more frequently and replace it as needed. GE says artificially softened water will cause the rod to consume more rapidly. The mechanism isn't mysterious. Softening trades calcium and magnesium for sodium, the water conducts a little better, and the sacrificial reaction the anode exists to host runs a little harder. Notice what that does to a 12-year term. The number on the box assumed a certain rate of consumption. Change the water chemistry and you've changed the rate without changing the number. This is the quiet one because there's no moment of error to point at. Just a household that made a reasonable upgrade and left the maintenance schedule underneath it untouched. The correction is to move the inspection interval and keep the softener. This is also where rod material stops being trivia. Magnesium is the more electrochemically active choice and gives stronger protection, which is the same reason it spends itself faster. Aluminum-zinc alloy rods are the usual answer where water is aggressive or where a magnesium rod is producing that rotten egg sulfur odor, since the zinc helps suppress the bacteria behind the smell. There's also a powered anode, a titanium rod driven by a small plug-in current supply that doesn't consume itself at all. One caution on that last one. It's an aftermarket part, and several manufacturers exclude damage caused by unapproved components, so ask before installing one on a tank still inside its coverage. Sixth is the setting on the dial, and this one has to be handled completely or not at all because both directions carry a real hazard. Turning the temperature up has good reasons behind it. More usable hot water out of the same tank for one, and the bacteria question is genuine. The A.O. Smith guide notes that a tank setting of 140 degrees Fahrenheit kills the bacteria that cause smelly water and can reduce levels of bacteria that cause waterborne disease. OSHA's Legionella guidance puts the danger zone for that organism at roughly 68 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit and recommends storing domestic hot water at a minimum of 140 degrees while delivering at least 122 to outlets. The other side is brutal. Arithmetic. The Consumer Product Safety Commission urges households to set water heaters to 120 degrees Fahrenheit and publishes the reason. Most adults will suffer third-degree burns from 2 seconds of exposure at 150 degrees, 6 seconds at 140, 30 seconds at 130. Even 120 can burn that badly given 5 minutes. The victims are overwhelmingly small children and the elderly who don't move away fast. Those two facts genuinely conflict, and the resolution is hardware. Store the water hot, then temper it before it reaches a tap. That's a thermostatic mixing valve, blending in cold automatically to hold delivered temperature down. A.O. Smith's guide cites the relevant national standard and states that the heater's thermostat should not be used as the sole means of regulating water temperature to avoid scalds, and that properly adjusted mixing valves belong at each point of use. Without that hardware installed and adjusted, a raised tank setting is a scald risk sitting in every faucet in the house, and if anyone under that roof is elderly, very young, or has limited mobility or sensation, the setting stays down until the valves are in. The warranty angle is smaller than people fear. Running the thermostat higher within its own range doesn't breach these documents. What REAM excludes is damage from operating at temperatures exceeding the maximum setting of the operating or high-limit control, meaning defeating the safety limit. What a higher setting does do is spin the corrosion clock faster and lay down deposits faster. A.O. Smith lists temperature setting among the variables that determine how quickly sediment builds. Hotter is a real choice with a real cost, and it deserves to be made on purpose. Which brings us to the seventh, the one made deliberately by the most careful owner in the story. He moves it, Finishes the basement, reworks the utility room, relocates the heater 8 feet to the left, sweats clean joints, does neat work. And the coverage is gone. Rheem excludes units removed from the original installation location. Full stop. A.O. Smith voids the warranty on the same ground. Bradford White extends its warranty to subsequent owners only as long as the heater remains at its original place of installation. Same idea, 3 companies. Modifications land in the same bucket. Rheem excludes damages from the use of any attachment, including any energy-saving device, not authorized by Rheem, and from operating with modified, altered, or unapproved parts installed. A.O. Smith excludes aftermarket equipment introduced into the sealed system without approval. Bradford White excludes alteration of factory-installed components and the addition of non-approved ones. Timers, recirculation gadgets, insulating wraps that cover a thermostat or a draft hood, all of it can put a claim on the wrong side of a sentence somebody wrote years ago. Here's the honest part. This one doesn't fit the key cleanly. Moving a tank across a room doesn't accelerate corrosion and doesn't change pressure. Neither does the demand for the original rating plate. Bradford White won't replace a heater without physical receipt of it, and Rheem requires it too. Photocopies not accepted. Neither does the 90-day claim window or A.O. Smith's condition that coverage belongs to the original purchaser only so long as that person continuously occupies the dwelling. So the key needs a third leg, and it's the one that explains the leftovers. Proof. Once a heater has been unhooked, hauled, and repiped by unknown hands, the manufacturer can no longer tell whether its own product failed or whether the second installation did. The rating plate is the serial numbered identity of the unit. Corrosion clock, pressure path, chain of custody. Read the exclusion list as 3 columns instead of 1, and no orphans are left in it, which makes the fair turn easy to say out loud. Several of these conditions would exist even if warranties had never been invented. Dry firing is the clearest. Electric elements are designed to be surrounded by water, and energizing one in an empty tank destroys it in seconds. That's why A.O. Smith's refill procedure has you hold a hot faucet open for 3 full minutes to purge air before power goes back on, and warns that skipping it can burn out the upper element. That exclusion is a description of physics. Same with the relief valve. A.O. Smith voids coverage where the heater has no certified temperature and pressure relief valve. Bradford White excludes installation without one. That valve is the last thing standing between a tank of superheated water and a genuine explosion, and its discharge line has rules for a reason. Full size, no valves or T's, slope to drain by gravity, no threads on the end, terminating within 6 inches of the floor where a person can see it. The manufacturer's guide says an explosion could occur if the valve or discharge pipe is blocked, and never to cap or plug either. If that line has been capped, plugged, run uphill, or reduced in size, put it at the top of the list and get it corrected today. 2 more safety boundaries belong right here, because half instructions are worse than none. Before draining a tank or touching an element, the energy comes off first. On an electric unit, switch off and lock out the breaker, then have absence of voltage verified at the heater with properly rated contact test equipment. A non-contact pin can be a useful warning tool, but it is not the final proof that a circuit is dead. On a gas unit, turn the control off and close the gas supply valve. Then open a hot faucet until the water runs cool so nobody is scalded by what leaves the drain valve. Testing the relief valve by lifting its lever is standard advice. Manufacturers generally call for operating it annually and inspecting it every few years. But on a valve that hasn't moved in a decade, debris or a hardened seat can leave it dripping afterward instead of reseating. Test it on a day you could tolerate replacing it, and hand the job to a plumber if a persistent drip would be a crisis. Leaving it untouched for a decade is the worst gamble. Sediment sits in a gentler category. The A.O. Smith Guide recommends draining and flushing after the first 6 months to see what your water is doing, repeating at least annually depending on hardness, and notes that sediment around the elements can cause noise and premature tank failure. All 3 warranties exclude failures traced to sediment or lime precipitate. What doesn't seem to exist is a clean, controlled study putting a number on how many years a homeowner's annual garden hose flush actually adds, and anyone quoting you one is guessing. The physical case is strongest on gas units, where a sediment bed sits directly over the burner and insulates the steel it's meant to heat. Flush anyway. The deposits are real and the manufacturer requires it, and that's reason enough without anybody promising you 5 extra years. Now the part that saves money at the counter. Standing between the 6-year model and the 12-year model of the same tank, ask one question: what's physically different? Sometimes very little. Bradford White's chart shows the tank warranty encoded right in the model number. One family of heater offered with 1, 6, 8, or 10-year coverage. Often the longer-term version carries a bigger anode or a second one, and that's the part worth paying for, because a second anode is more sacrificial metal, which is more corrosion clock. Ask for the spec sheet and count the rods. If the premium buys a second one, it's usually money well spent in aggressive or softened water and close to a wash where one rod was going to last anyway. If it buys only a longer sentence on a certificate, remember that certificate still requires the rod to be maintained. The longest term in the aisle protects a neglected tank exactly as well as the shortest one does. Tankless changes the arithmetic entirely and is a separate conversation. So, the order to work in. First, before anything else, look at the relief valve and its discharge line, because that one is safety ahead of coverage. Full-size pipe, slope down, no cap, no valve, terminating low and visible. If it's wrong, fix it or have it fixed today. Second, photograph the rating plate with the model and serial number and find the paperwork proving the installation date. If it doesn't exist, you've just learned your coverage may be measured from manufacturer and you should behave accordingly. Third, put a gauge on a hose bib and find out whether you're on a closed system with climbing pressure. If you are and there's no expansion tank, that's the highest value part on this list per dollar. If there is one, have its charge checked. Fourth, get the anode rod inspected and write down the date and its condition. That single observation sets every future interval and it tightens if you're on softened water. Fifth, settle the temperature question deliberately, mixing valves in and adjusted, then store hot if the bacteria concern applies to your household. No valves, no raised setting, and if anyone under your roof is a small child, elderly, or can't move quickly out of hot water, the setting stays down until the valves are in. Full stop. Sixth, flush the tank with power or gas off and the water run cool first. Then keep one folder, paper or digital, holding the installation invoice, the plate photo, the registration confirmation, and a running note of every inspection with its date. That folder is what turns a phone call in year 8 from a debate into a transaction. That's the whole discipline. A handful of small facts written down and a couple of parts that cost less than a tank of gas. No heroic afternoon required. If you carry one thing down to your own utility room, make it the gauge test. 5 minutes and it catches the failure nobody sees coming. Drop your cold reading and your after a cycle reading in the comments, along with whether that anode rod has ever been pulled. Closed systems are far more common now than most owners realize, and the spread of those numbers is genuinely interesting. Hit like if the gauge test earned its 5 minutes, and subscribe if you would rather find out what your house needs while it is still the cheap version of the problem.